Hello and welcome to the first lecture for Topic 7, and Topic 7 looks at issues in policing. In this lecture, we're going to place the issue of policing in the context of democracy. And so first we're going to start by taking a look at the challenges and obligations of policing in a democratic society. Then we're going to turn our sights to look at who are the police. Now, for this semester, we're going to be reading two chapters about the police. The chapter that you're reading this week, which is chapter 7 on issues in policing. And then next week, we're going to be looking at police and the rule of law that looks at the laws governing proper searches, seizures, interrogations, etc. But what we don't read, it's in your textbook if you want to read it, but what we don't read is looking at sort of the overall organization of the police. And so in this lecture, I just wanted to provide you some information about the way that law enforcement is organized in the United States and how that organization is a reflection of federalism. I won't go into too much detail, but at least this way you get a sense of all the different levels of policing that we have in the United States, and the way that the law enforcement is organized in the United States. And then we're going to be taking a look at the demographic composition of the police. The police are no longer high school educated white guys that, for a variety of reasons, we have much more diversity within police forces, but there's still a long way to go to have the police force look demographically similar to the general population in the United States. So those are the things that we're going to look at in this lecture. So let's get started. It is always important to obviously study law enforcement in the United States, but this is an especially crucial time in America to be studying policing. And I would be remiss if I did not note that today or this week started the trial of the police officer from Minneapolis, Derek Chauvin, a former police officer. He's been fired from the force. But who's been charged with second and third degree murder and also manslaughter for the death of George Floyd. And both of those individuals are in the photograph there. On the left-hand side, obviously, George Floyd. On the other side is Derek Chauvin. He's the person who had his knee on the neck of George Floyd for what now seems to be, nearly close to 10 minutes as a result of the information that's coming out from the trial. And so, it's very difficult, but not impossible to convict law enforcement of police brutality and excessive use of force. And we'll see what happens with this trial. But thinking, I'm sure you guys are watching and reading about the trial, and it really brings to the forefront many of the issues that we're going to be studying about in this chapter, so that as you're paying attention to the trial of Derek Chauvin, obviously try to begin making some connections between what's happening in the real world and what you're learning about in the textbook. So when it comes to policing, it's really easy to fight crime in an authoritarian system. An authoritarian system of government is the kind of government wherein the government has virtually no limits on its power. The government and state actors can basically do whatever they want. And it's pretty easy to fight crime in an authoritarian government because the state can do whatever they want. And the individuals and usually in an authoritarian government, are afforded little to no rights. So, if cops want to fight crime, I mean, they don't even need to follow the law regarding what is defined as a crime because there are no limits placed on the government. The way they fight crime, they can do it however they want. Search you, they don't have a reason to search you. Apprehend you, you don't need to be told why you're being apprehended. And the individual has no rights, so there's no sort of recourse to the power of the state. Remember, we were sort of talking about the due process perspective and how the due process perspective sees the state as mighty and the individual as weak. And by following due process, fair procedures, you kind of level the playing field between the individual and the state. Well, in an authoritarian government, there's no leveling of the playing field. But gosh darn it, if you want, it's easy to fight crime because the state can crack down in any way that they want. It's much more difficult to fight crime, obviously, in a democracy. In a democracy, in particular, a constitutional democracy, there are clear limits that are placed on the powers of government, and there are clear enumerated liberties that are afforded to, or granted to, or guaranteed to the people that live in that country. It's much more difficult to fight crime in a democracy because government power is limited and people have rights. But on the same hand, it's really important to, protect the so-called social contract. I'm oftentimes, I teach civil liberties, so I'm often telling my students in civil liberties that, that you have the freedom of speech, you have the right to practice your religion. But if the world outside is, of your life, if the world is so chaotic and dangerous, it doesn't matter that you have freedom of speech because you're afraid to leave your house. It doesn't matter that you can worship because, you're afraid you're going to get shot walking down to the church, right? And so it's important to uphold the social contract. And the social contract is basically defined loosely here, and I'll explain it a little bit more in a moment, is that it's this implicit agreement among members of society to cooperate for the social good. And so, when you look at social contract theorists, there's this idea that, that when you don't have a contract with the other people in the society that you live with, there's kind of a cool aspect of that because you can do whatever the F you want, right? Thomas Hobbes called it the state of nature. It's a great place because it's maximum liberty. There's no restraints in your liberty. You can do whatever the F you want, right? But who wants to live in that world, right? I mean, like I was talking about, if people can do whatever they want, it's going to be a pretty dangerous place outside your door. And so a social contract is where you basically, people that live in a society, they give up some of their liberties. They say, look, I recognize I can't do whatever I want, particularly when what I am doing in the name of liberty is harming others. And then we empower the government to basically punish those who violate the social contract, right? So in a democracy, it's important that that social contract is protected and that the government does need the tools necessary in order to punish and hold accountable those who violate the social contract. But, and here's the catch, and that's where it makes it difficult, that the social contract needs to be maintained in a way that doesn't violate key values of a democracy. So on the one hand, you have to make sure that we have law and order and that people feel safe. But on the other hand, we have to maintain that safety and that order in a way that follows the law, that doesn't violate due process, and respects individual liberty. And as you're going to see in this chapter, and as you're going to see in the next chapter, and as you listen to the podcast that you're listening to this week about how cops see it differently, you're going to see that policing in the United States can be very challenging, particularly if we want to live up to those dual aspects of keeping safety, but doing it in a way that doesn't erode democracy. Now, law enforcement obviously is an essential component of a democratic society because the social contract needs to be maintained. Law enforcement, we sort of know this from learning about the different steps within the criminal justice process, that law enforcement is at the forefront of protecting the social contract. Law enforcement is there, cops are there in order to make this initial contact, whether it's walking the beat and observing disorderly or criminal conduct in action, whether through investigating wrongdoing, and then apprehending those who offend the so-called social contract. And so law enforcement are at the forefront of protecting the social contract. You can't live in a democracy if the social contract is meaningless. We give law enforcement a tremendous amount of power to achieve this goal. But then we also trust law enforcement, but we also train law enforcement that they exercise this power in a way that is not an affront to democratic society. And so law enforcement are granted tremendous power when it comes to initial contact, investigating and arresting people. They have the power to use lethal force in order to achieve that goal. And they're granted a lot of discretion in the way that they do their job. And in the next lecture, we're going to be talking about the importance of discretion, but some of the challenges of discretion as well. That, law enforcement are make decisions as the environment presents itself to them. So they can't, they have to be able to react to what they're experiencing in a way where they exercise their best judgment. We hope that the way that they exercise their best judgment is corresponds to democratic values, but that can be a challenge. And so they must use the power in a way that protects the social contract, and so they need to hold people accountable, but they must do it in a way where it's reasonable, proportionate, within the bounds of civil liberties and civil rights. And that can be a challenge, as we'll see in these chapters. And so law enforcement are faced with extraordinary challenges that make it difficult to do their job, but it's also essential that they do their job correctly, because without law enforcement, it's very difficult to maintain a democracy and to preserve the social contract. So keep some of those things in mind as we're moving forward. Okay, so in the last slides, we were talking about the important role that law enforcement plays in maintaining a democratic society. Now we're going to shift gears, and we're going to be talking about who are the police. And we're going to talk about that from two perspectives. One, we're going to look at, when we say who are the police, we're going to be looking at, well, what are the different agencies of law enforcement, okay? And then we're going to take a look at the demographics of the police. Like, who are the police? Like, what are the people that make up the police? So let's first start with the agencies of of law enforcement in the United States. Now, earlier in the semester, I think we talked about this concept known as federalism. And federalism it's a part of the way that our governmental system in the United States is set up. And what federalism is, as it says there, is it's the constitutional division of power between the national and state governments. And so when you look at our Constitution, that our Constitution gives certain powers to the national government, and these are outlined in the Constitution. Powers such as the power to declare war, the power to coin money, the power to regulate interstate commerce. That's where a lot of federal criminal code comes from. And so those are the powers that are sort of like enumerated, expressed powers that are given to the national government. Now, the Constitution also tells us that there's certain powers that states can't engage in, okay? That they're forbidden from engaging in. So, for example, states cannot form treaties with other countries, okay? There are more powers than that are forbidden to the state governments. And so unless the power is expressly given to the national government, or unless it's a power that's expressly forbidden from the states to engage in, there's this amendment in our Bill of Rights called the 10th Amendment. And it basically says all other powers are reserved to the people in the states. And those are known as the reserved powers. And that's a lot of power that's reserved to the states. It's also oftentimes referred to as police powers, because it's basically the way that those reserve powers have played itself out is that there's nothing giving Congress the power to like regulate directly behavior, basically saying this behavior is criminal and this behavior is not criminal. It's limited in terms of the way the national government can engage in defining certain behaviors as criminal. So a lot of that is defined by the states. And so police powers are this power that the states have to regulate behavior and morality. And so the vast majority of criminal law and the enforcement of criminal law is, as you'll see, comes about through the local and state law enforcement agencies. But this federal relationship, this power sharing relationship, is reflected in the different agencies of law enforcement in the United States. So let's do a quick overview of what those different agencies are. So let's first take a look at the federal law enforcement agencies. So federal law enforcement enforces all federal law and protects U.S. citizens. I mean, that's basically its jurisdiction, right? Its jurisdiction is enforcing federal law. Law enforcement at the federal level is housed in the United States Department of Justice. and that is basically the legal arm of the federal government. And so, as the legal arm of the federal government, that when the federal law is violated, then it's their responsibility to investigate and prosecute individuals who violate federal law. But they are also responsible for ensuring that civil rights violations, that people aren't discriminated against. So that's a big part of the United States Department of Justice, which is kind of outside of criminal law. And is also, responsible for, terrorism and threats to homeland security, which are obviously part of criminal law, but they're like kind of beyond the scope of just your normal federal criminal code. So the U.S. Department of Justice is the legal arm of the federal government, and it's headed by the Attorney General, and that the Attorney General serves at the pleasure of the President. They are nominated by the President and confirmed by the Senate. And just recently, the new Attorney General, the previous Attorney General was William Barr. When a president leaves office, then basically for the most part, the terms of the heads of the different federal departments, their job is over because their president is no longer there. And the new president comes in and appoints a bunch of new secretaries, or in this case, the Attorney General. And Merrick Garland was just recently nominated as the United States Attorney General. His name might sound familiar to you because if you remember back when Antonin Scalia, the Associate Justice, died right at the end of President Obama's term, the majority leader of the Senate, Mitch McConnell, basically said, well, we're not going to seat a new justice until the presidential election. And President Obama had nominated Merrick Garland to replace Justice Scalia, but that the Senate never considered his nomination. So that's why that name might sound familiar. Included in, again, this is just sort of an overview, but, included in the federal law enforcement agencies are, big ones are the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and also the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, and there are many others. And so, as I said, that, the kinds of law that federal law enforcement agencies enforce are civil rights violations, violations of the Federal Criminal Code, violations of the tax code law, terrorism, drug trafficking, organized crime, because those take place and have an impact on interstate commerce, etc. So that's one, who are law enforcement. One aspect of law enforcement are federal law enforcement agents. Another law enforcement agency are the state law enforcement agencies. State law enforcement agencies enforce state law. A federal agency enforces federal law. State enforces state law. And it comes in two main sort of varieties. One aspect is that state police generally enforce state law and have these broad sort of police powers, but also that state police can be designated with patrolling highways and traffic enforcement on the state highways and on the interstates that run through their states. So depending on what state you're in, you can have different sort of levels of state police engagement throughout the state. Just like the national government has the United States Department of Justice, Wisconsin also has a Department of Justice and also has an Attorney General. And within the Wisconsin Department of Justice, there are two major divisions. One division is the Division of Criminal Investigation. So you have state special agents that engage in criminal investigation, and these are usually investigations of crimes that have statewide implications. That's what our Wisconsin State Law Enforcement Agency sort of focuses on. And so they investigate crimes of statewide implication, such as human trafficking throughout the state of Wisconsin, internet predation of children throughout the state of Wisconsin. So that's just some examples. Also, there's the Division of Law Enforcement. And what the Division of Law Enforcement does is that that division sort of focuses on criminal information that can be used throughout the state. So a state forensic lab, the state rape kit, investigations, doing those sorts of analysis and that. So the Division of Law Enforcement focuses on those sort of keeping of information and collecting information that can help municipal law enforcement throughout the state. We do have a state patrol, obviously, in Wisconsin, but they are housed in the Wisconsin Department of Transportation. And so that's how our sort of law enforcement at the state level is organized. Now, due to federalism, the vast majority of policing takes place at the local level. And the local level includes both the county level and the municipal level, okay? And so the podcast that you're listening to this week is about the Milwaukee Police Department. That's an example of a municipal or city police force. And so county law enforcement their jurisdiction is to enforce state law and also county ordinances. And so oftentimes you'll see the sheriff department also involved in patrolling the state or the highways within the county. When we get to the section on corrections, you're going to see that jails are under the jurisdiction of county law enforcement, the sheriff's department. That's also the sheriff's department is the county. But city police or municipal police are the most common type of law enforcement officials. That they have very broad authority to enforce state and local laws within their jurisdiction, within their municipality, within their city. So they do traffic enforcement, but they also will investigate narcotics and vice. They do patrolling, crime prevention and investigation, search and rescue, etc. And so there's a vast law enforcement activities that municipal law enforcement engages in. And you'll see that when you listen to the podcast. So the last thing we're going to talk about is who are the police and the demographics of police departments in the United States. Now, in your textbook, that they have some really good graphs that I would encourage you to take a look at that basically show you the demographic breakdown of police departments throughout the United States. Key things to keep in mind is that the composition of American policing, the American police has really changed a lot. It's no longer an all-white male endeavor where if your dad's a cop, you become a cop. Not that doesn't exist, but and that the highest level of education that somebody has is a high school graduation level. The demographics of the police force are really changing. For one, criminal justice programs are in high demand in U.S. colleges, and that gets reflected in the level of education that people in the police force have. So in the state of Wisconsin, you're required to obtain at least an associate's degree within 5 years of being becoming a member of the police force in Wisconsin. And so we do demand some higher level of education, and they talk about whether that matters in the textbook. And also, coming out of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the move that Congress has made in order to make sure that we have a diverse workforce, that there are affirmative action programs that are making sure that minorities and women aren't being discriminated against in terms of employment, and the policing of that discrimination through affirmative action programs and the Civil Rights, the Equal Opportunity Commission has resulted in an increase in diversity within many aspects of the American workforce, but in policing is subject to that kind of diversity as well. So as you are learning about diversity in the textbook as it relates to policing in the United States, just keep a couple of things in mind. For one, diversity matters. It matters symbolically, but it also has a real-world implication as well. Earlier in this lecture, we were talking about the importance of democracy, policing in a democratic society. And if the police force doesn't look like the people that it is policing, it sends a message symbolically that the police force don't really represent the people that they are actually, trying to patrol. And so if you live in a diverse community, but your police force is all white, that sort of sends a message that there's this gap that, between the police officers and the people that they're actually charged with protecting and enforcing the law. And so there can be a symbolic aspect to the importance of diversity because we have more trust sometimes in our elected officials, or in this case, in our police officials, if we feel like that they look like the community that they're serving. But it also has a realistic implication as well, realistic might not be the right word choice there, maybe a real world implication as well, because the way that minority police officers and women police officers police is actually different than the way that white male police officers police. Your textbook talks about when it comes to women in law enforcement, that women in law enforcement are much more likely than their male colleagues to get support from the community. And you're actually going to sort of see that in the podcast, hear that in the podcast. They're a lot less likely to be charged with improper conduct, and that they're much more likely that their arrests actually result in convictions. And so that, the more women that you have in the police force, then it might actually improve the way policing is done in the United States. Also, it's important to keep in mind that the challenges that minority police officers and women police officers face are different than the challenges faced by white male police officers. All police officers face challenges, okay? But the challenges that minority women police officers face are different. So make sure that you read in your textbook about this concept of double marginality. This concept of double marginality is that, on the one hand, African American officers feel that there's an expectation that maybe of other law enforcement that because they're Black, they're going to give members of their own race a break. And so there might be a perception there that they have to deal with. But they also have to deal with sort of the overt racism from their police colleagues, and also sort of the sense that you're Black and you're part of the police force, like you're part of the enemy group, right? Like if there's a lot of distrust of police within the minority community. So, this double marginality, the sense that there's a lot of challenges that minority officers face, is something to take into consideration. When it comes to women, there's, the sense that they're challenging the perception and also the reality that policing is seen as sort of a masculine endeavor, that policing equals masculinity. And so that your textbook sort of talks about that sometimes women try to counter that by being aggressive police, but then if they do that, they're criticized for being too aggressive. But then if they take a less aggressive role or play a behind the scenes role, then they're sort of seen as like, oh, not willing to get their feet, like actually do the hard work associated with policing. Just kind of a double bind that women are sometimes in. So diversity matters for a lot of reasons, and make sure that you sort of read about that in chapter 7. Okay, thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you again soon.